There are causes for concern in Turkey, but I don't see how the Turkish problem is going to have much of an impact on anybody else than a short-term effect on investor sentiment. Fundamentals in EM are not really the same as in Turkey, elsewhere. So I don't see this problem being anything other than idiosyncratic and specific to Turkey. As such, if investors in a fit of nervousness end up selling a whole bunch of EM countries other than Turkey, I think that constitutes a value opportunity, and investors should really sort of start nibbling into that market and get some assets on board that they liked before Friday and now can get at a couple of % cheaper.
And yet, Daniel, we have seen other key emerging market currencies weaken against the dollar in light of all of this. We've seen equities in those markets sell off. Where do you fall on this?
Well, I think the real impact that we see is what the threat and then follow through of sanctions, even limited sanctions, can do to an economy. I was in Europe a few weeks ago when the news broke of Trump considering sanctioning Turkey, and that began a significant cascade in terms of what it did to the Turkish economy. And if you look at what was actually done, 2 Turkish government ministers were put on a government blacklist that prohibits U.S. companies from dealing with them. They likely have no assets here. It's symbolic, if nothing else.
How unusual is it to see the U.S. level sanctions on officials in a NATO country?
This is unusual. It's also unusual if you think about all the countries around the world where Americans, even journalists, may be held captive, prisoner. They've never used sanctions to try and force a negotiation like this, to force the release. That sanctions have been generally constrained for much larger, significant crises, human rights violations, terrorism, weapons of mass destruction. This as an isolated event is a little unique.
Is it isolated, or we've had some this morning suggest that maybe it's the opening of a new chapter in how they're used?
Sanctions are very much a favorite tool for foreign policy within this administration. If you think about how the president likes to gain market reaction, it's like an economic missile, essentially, because all you have to do is threaten the usage of them, and whoever the target is, whether it's a private company or a country, is going to see an immediate impact on its value.
So you see the frequency of its use increasing?
I think we have seen the frequency of its use being increasing. The other thing is we're seeing as they come across larger markets, if you saw what happened with Russia on April 6th, there's some unanticipated consequences. I don't believe the administration was trying to destroy the Turkish economy, but send a shot across the bow. It's kind of a very fine balance of what you can actually do to not destabilize a country, but achieve your foreign policy goals.
Jan, I'm curious why you think that the impact won't be widespread, particularly in the short term. I mean, what about the folks that have been loaning money to Turkey? Why shouldn't this spread in the direction of those folks?
Well, let me make one point first. Turkey has been working pretty consistently for 8 years in trying to screw up its own economy. And the sanctions against 2 ministers was really only the straw that broke the camel's back. If Turkey hadn't built up major domestic macroeconomic imbalances in the first place, you wouldn't have had nearly as big a reaction. So that's the first point. The second point is that to the extent that sanctions get applied this frivolously across a larger number of countries, ultimately this undermines soft power in the U.S., the ability to do so, because you start undermining the credibility of working with the United States, and you start seeing countries turning elsewhere and starting to finance from other sources. So ultimately, it's a little bit like, if you'll excuse the expression, peeing in your pants to keep warm. You might get a short-term benefit from it, but in the long term, you probably wish you hadn't done it.